Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our Millennial Roundtable. I'm the honorary millennial, but I do have some millennials with me today. And, of course, we have a lot of things we could cover. We're only going to focus on a few. But, of course, 50 years ago today, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. And that is something that at least the old guy around the table remembers vividly. We, of course, had the YouTube shooter yesterday, self-described vegan bodybuilder. And we might not get into that too much, but we'll see how that plays out. Of course, we keep paying attention to the immigrant caravan making its way through Mexico. Whether it will end up on our borders, we'll see. And while we're talking about immigration, of course, the last couple of days we've talked about that citizenship question on the 2020 census. But I think we're going to focus a lot of time and attention today on the teacher walkouts. It's something we have not talked about until now, and that will be a chance for us to look at what happened and is happening in Oklahoma, what happened in the past in West Virginia, some of the reasons for that, and, of course, most importantly, I'd love to get your comments. So what are your thoughts about teachers walking out? What are your thoughts about some of the pay issues that certainly are front and center? Lots of things to cover there. A little bit later, of course, we also have posted some articles. What's wrong with Washington? Some things, the Trump trade deal and China's response. And we've also posted one on some that seem to be addicted to their cell phone, and the thing they dread most is if the battery runs out. So we got lots to cover here today. We have in studio with us, as we always do, Chelsey, Youman. And Chelsey, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be with you guys today.
Counsel with, of course, First Liberty, used to be chief of staff at that point.
Right.
And we've seen her on a number of television programs and other venues as well. And Caroline Lewis. Now, it's been a while since we've had you on. And actually, since the last time we had you on, of course, you've served as the Director of Communications for Americans United for Life, and also founded and were the Executive Director of Legalize Life International. And she's also a graduate like you of SMU. So
I am.
Thank you for being here as well.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, we've got to talk about this. Teachers in Oklahoma decided to walk out. Now, the attempt was to try to deal with this funding crisis, but Chelsey, you've got at least a mother that I know works in the schools. Now, she's a counselor, so it's a little different for a counselor than a teacher. But I thought you probably had a few thoughts about teachers deciding to walk out and leave the students to their own devices.
Definitely. Well, truth be told, I was actually a little bit divided about this issue because I didn't know a ton about it in Oklahoma. You know, there's a walkout in Oklahoma following, I believe it was West Virginia's walkout, and there are multiple maybe scheduled across the country.
That's right.
So
More to come.
I'm reading up and learning, but I always think before I develop an opinion that I just have to learn more facts. I have to understand the dynamic, and every state is different. Here in Texas, we all have our own educational issues and different ways we want to resolve it. And my mom always talks about just how large their schools are and their classrooms are and how many hands on deck there need to be. But overall, the general needs of the students are being met in her district. In Oklahoma, I was very surprised to read that classrooms are now reaching sizes of 35 to 40 students because of a complete teacher crisis. And this isn't just the walkout, it's beyond that. It's teachers, they'll raise thousands of teachers in the schools and universities, they'll get licensed, and then they will exodus from Oklahoma and go to Texas or neighboring states who pay more or might have better. Also, the schools have gone down to 4 days a week instead of 5. So this is a huge issue with a lot of dynamics that are unique to Oklahoma that I think we should get into today.
Oh, I think so. Caroline, you've been looking at this as well. Where we talk about Oklahoma because that's next door to those of us here in the state of Texas, but also Kentucky. And in the next hour, when we have our national audience, of course, we'll be hearing from people in Oklahoma and Kentucky that probably have some thoughts about that, as well as some of our listeners in West Virginia. But this is becoming kind of a national phenomenon because I've been hearing Arizona and some others are going to maybe follow suit. So do we have a national teachers walkout coming sometime in the future? What's your thoughts?
You know, I don't know. I think that there is something. I think something that I've seen recently, not in the past year, is that there's just this huge rise of protests, and whether it's teacher walkouts or whether it's gun marches or whether it's, you know, I mean, it's every women's march. I mean, you name it, whatever your issue is, there is a march for you, or
Right.
you can create it. And I think that in a way that kind of dilutes a little bit of kind of the normal civic process. And while it can be very effective to amass masses of people for their grievances, I think that, you know, I think that it might be better to be able to do it through the regular process.
I would think so. Yeah, and I was just thinking about that because we all would say that, look, even in Oklahoma, they had a last-minute kind of answer to the funding crisis, and there have been attempts in Kentucky and West Virginia and others to deal with it. But I guess it's working because look what we're talking about today. You know, if they were still having negotiations in the Oklahoma legislature and the Kentucky legislature, of course, they're talking about Arizona and some of the others, we wouldn't be talking about it. But the fact is, I guess it works a little bit, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, absolutely. People are talking, and you know, it worked for even just a 1% bump in West Virginia from 4% to 5% pay increase.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so interesting. I'm so torn. You know, I think everyone has, you know, a right to their First Amendment rights to protest, et cetera. But it is really hard to see that students are not in classrooms or going to school across the state for these issues. So I would hope that there's some amicable resolutions that they could reach. I did read some statistics that if you account for inflation in the last, you know, 5 to 8 years, that they are 15% behind other states in pay. Right. And so what that means is there's no adjustment for inflation or even administrative costs. The school districts have cut costs across the board for school supplies, classrooms, et cetera, trying to pay teachers. And then the issue becomes really that teachers are now paying out of pocket for school supplies. Mm-hmm. And I read that there's a twofold issue here. They're saying, yes, teacher pay is one part of the issue, but the other part is that the size of the classrooms being 40 students, you know, they're not able to actually teach right now. They're just making sure no one is throwing pencils at each other in the classroom. It's
right.
Really devolved into a major educational crisis in Oklahoma that needs to be resolved. And there's just a lot at play here. They said it's a rural issue versus more suburban city issue because they're getting statewide pay is kind of the same. And so the states are allowed to have bonds at the local level, but those can only go to buildings and not really teacher salaries. So you have these really nice buildings and then terrible situations in the classrooms.
Yeah. And I want to come back to the structural issue, but let me just at least reinforce as we go to our break here, the fact that the size of the classes are part of the problem. One of the people quoted in this article, it was a National Review, said, when I began teaching, most classes had 18 to 21 kids in them. Now you'll see 36 kids in a class. I've seen kids sit on the floor. And you think about this, when you have classes with 30 to 35 kids, especially in the middle school, because I call middle school kids electric chihuahuas. You've heard that phrase probably before. They are all over the map. And you talk about 35 kids, and a few of them may be a little bit undisciplined. You are not teaching. You are just trying to keep order. And so we come back. We want to talk about this. You know, why did this happen? Also, another article that I have yet to quote from is, why are the states so strapped for cash? Now, that doesn't apply quite as much to Oklahoma, a little bit, but it applies to some of these other states because of mandates and Medicaid and those kinds of things, they don't have enough money. And so Oklahoma's going to have to restructure some things, Kentucky and some of the rest. So we've got a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Imagine you were in the midst of a discussion about nuclear arms policy, and in the midst of your debate, the other person says something like, I don't think it's fair that only the United States and Russia have nuclear weapons. You pause and then explain that many other countries, like China, France, England, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, also have nuclear weapons. And at this point, you might want to suggest that person learn a little bit more about nuclear arms before making dogmatic statements concerning nuclear arms policy. Change nuclear arms for guns, and you have an illustration of what often takes place in the gun control debate. The posters at the March for Our Lives rally and the slogans in many interviews and speeches illustrate a level of ignorance. But gun control advocates have a ready response to anyone questioning their understanding of guns. They use the term gunsplaining. Adam Weinstein coined the term in a widely shared Washington Post op-ed. He defines the term as the habit of gun rights activists to bully gun control activists with technical jargon. And I will admit that sometimes is true. You see this in just about any discussion where someone uses technical terms to intimidate you into silence. Can we also agree that many of the posters and rallies and slogans used in debates are inaccurate? Is it really easier to buy an AR-15 than to buy Sudafed, fireworks, or birth control pills? Is the NRA really America's ISIS? Do you really believe that guns are so unregulated that any person can buy a fully automatic machine gun? Any American can express his or her opinion about any topic, even their opinion about guns and gun control. But that doesn't mean we have to take seriously every one of those opinions, especially when they're based in ignorance and sprinkled with condescension. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation at any point, feel free to do so. A couple questions on the table. First of all, do you feel good about teachers actually going on strike? There have been times in the past where strikes have been very effective. There have been times when people go out on strike and they've been fired. You might remember, at least those of us a little bit older around the table, remember a time when Ronald Reagan had the air traffic controllers went out on strike and he said, good, don't come back, and he fired them. That's not going to happen in this particular case, but what are your thoughts? Do teachers have valid concerns about pay and just the overcrowding of the classroom? But what about the response, and that is those who have decided to walk out? And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to hear from any of you on that. Of course, we have all sorts of other issues we're going to cover here today. But let's come back to the one that you mentioned just a minute ago, Chelsey, because that seems to be a problem. We posted this article from the New York Times, but there also is one that has from the National Review. And it's kind of interesting that the argument they're making is that part of this has to do with the institutional structure. In Oklahoma, you can't raise the funds for your public school because your hands are tied. And Oklahoma says, well, we're just a poor state. And they're saying, no, not really. You got oil and gas. You've got all sorts of things that Texas has. And yet you seem to have done a pretty good job of ruining the public schools and angering most of the teachers in the state of Oklahoma. What about that?
Right. It definitely seems like Oklahoma, and every state is going to be different than the next. They're going to have their own institutional obstacles or problems for resolving these issues. So I don't think you can have a one size fits all model for education. But they definitely have other models to look throughout the country. So we know that Oklahoma teachers are paid among the lowest in the entire country. But there are other issues such as their budgetary structure. So former Senator Tom Cogburn came out and said, if the budget has $500 to $700 million as is right now to help resolve this issue without raising taxes, which is, the dirty word among Republicans in Oklahoma. They don't want their taxes to be raised. But maybe there are other types of cuts or restructuring that the government can do. Teachers are government officials, after all. And so maybe there's a way they can care for these needs and meet these needs and really ensure that they're having teachers stay in the state and stay to educate their children internally without having, to really revamp the tax system and tax code.
What do you think about trying to maybe make some institutional changes, Caroline?
I think that's a good idea. I think another piece of this issue is teachers' unions and the problems there, like the American Federation of Teachers. The head of that, Rhonda Weingarten, is paid almost $500,000. It's $497,118 per year, according to Union Facts.
Yeah.
And then they give $45 million to the Democrat Party that last election cycle. So, is that really that's not going to the students. That's not paying for pencils. That's not helping. That's repurposing teachers' unions for political purposes. And I don't think that's right. So I think that there's a multifaceted piece to this. And I think Chelsey touched on some of the key issues, that there really are problems here, and that the teachers have legitimate concerns. And perhaps the protest is a result of legislators or people not listening properly to their concerns. So that's something to examine. But I also think that another thing to examine is where is the money going in the overall Oklahoma budget? Where is all the money going? And maybe it's time, like the rest of us in the world do, is look at, what is my budget every month? And maybe I don't need to be buying things that are unnecessary. Like maybe it's time to reevaluate and audit what Oklahoma is really spending their money on, and try to prioritize it and help some of these teachers out, or at least have better priorities.
One of the interviews we did just a week ago was from Lance Izumi, and it's called The Corrupt Classroom. And Chapter 3 is all about the fiscal mismanagement of the educational establishment. And we spent some time talking about that, so I'll just use one illustration. What's the largest school district in the country? Los Angeles Independent School District, largest school district in the country. They have a number of challenges because you have so many kids speaking so many different languages, so many different nationalities, and they were running into a budget crisis like we're talking about right here. And so they actually hired an audit. They did. That is, the school district hired someone to audit, and at the end said, you've got some major financial issues. You're going to have to, as Caroline suggested, tighten your belt. What's the next thing they did? They went out there and spent more money. And so if you do that, I think there's a sense sometimes, Chelsey, that, we can just keep spending like drunken sailors, which is an apology to drunken sailors, by the way, that we can be just so fiscally mismanaging the school system that we always know the taxpayers or the legislature will bail us out. Maybe it's time to say, just like we do around the kitchen table, we need to reevaluate our budgets.
Well, I would hope that the Oklahoma government would do that out of respect to its citizens. But I do believe that I read that the governor actually vetoed a bill that was going to make the budget fiscally open, like an open public record.
Transparent.
Very transparent.
Yes.
If you can't have the public oversight of the budget that they're helping pay for, if you're not even willing to begin that process, I think it's going to be you're going to be hard pressed to find government officials willing to support really upheaval. But there are a few things I think we can all agree on. One is that education's important. We can all agree that it is not a social experiment, that our children are not social experiments, and that this is really an important priority. And even though we disagree on the ways to get there, I think that there has to be more of a dialogue at the legislative level. You mentioned the civil process earlier, Caroline. I think that's so true, that really it's up to the representatives at the state level and the senators at the state level to build some resolutions here. And it's their job. Fix this.
Caroline, the other one that you sort of alluded to is the fact that we have a top-heavy administration. I remember years ago we had a chance to interview Bill Bennett, who at that time was the Secretary of Education, and he pointed out that one time when he went to the parochial school system in New York City, he was asking, now, who runs all this? And he says, well, Sister June does this, and Sister Marie does that, and one other, and like, you mean the entire parochial system of the entire city of New York City is run essentially by a handful of nuns? And he said, yes. He said, now compare that to the huge bureaucracy that has grown in New York City to actually oversee the public school system. And I suspect that whether you look at Oklahoma or Kentucky or West Virginia, you're going to have a lot of individuals, back to your point, that are collecting very significant salaries, but it's not impacting at all what happens in the classroom.
Right. I would completely agree. And I think that this whole teacher walkout situation may be pointing us to really examining what privatization of education would look like. Because obviously the government is not doing such a great job, not just in Oklahoma, but as a whole. I think that students that come from let me say it this way, that I think that when you have an incentive structure, like we're in Dallas, there are a lot of private schools. There are Jewish schools, there are Catholic schools, there are non-religious schools, there are religious schools, there are all Montessori schools. And some of them, they're all competing for students. And they all say, okay, some of them have uniforms, some of them don't have uniforms, some of them use classic text, some of them do not. And they're all, some of them have great sports, some of them have great arts. Okay, so as a parent, you look at that and you go, okay, I want my kid to go here or here, and you have choices. And this is educational choice. But the other part of that is that there's an incentive for these schools to compete with one another. They want to, they want, it's essentially a business. So they want the customers, which are the parents, to choose their school. And there is no incentive structure in the government. The customer will always be there because we have, in many places, an antiquated zip code concept that says, if you live in this area, you must go to this school. So parents really don't have a choice unless they move. And some parents can't afford to move to another place. And I think there's room. I think that there's room in this discussion for what it would look like to have more private schools, more
in school choice, which is the subtitle of the book.
And school choice. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Bias, indoctrination, violence, social engineering show why America needs school choice. So, and of course, we didn't even mention the fiscal mismanagement. And so there are all sorts of very good arguments. But let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Got a great round table of very bright women, but we'd love to hear from you as well. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the teacher walkout. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But since I have my lawyer in here, we have a couple of cases, and one of those I thought was kind of intriguing, just something that Caroline mentioned just a minute ago, is you have, of course, a Supreme Court case that is going to actually be decided as to whether or not public sector unions can require workers to pay membership fees. And what I thought was so interesting, Chelsey, is this relates to so many of these compelled speech cases. Let me try to get them all correct. I might get one off and you can help me out. But one is the compelled speech of Jack Phillips. And of course, you have that one, Aaron and Melissa Klein, where in this case, we compelled a Christian baker to bake a cake for a lesbian couple or a homosexual couple. So that's one of those compelled speech cases. Then you have the one of the pregnancy resource centers out of California and other places that compelled them to actually advertise for abortion. I want to get Caroline's comments on this in just a minute, which just is hard to imagine that you would compel that case. And then you have this one, sort of a compelled speech, or at least compelled assembly, or however you want to say it, participation, which would say that even if you disagree with the way the teachers' unions or the public sector unions spend the money, because most of it goes to Democrats, you still have to pay it. So the Supreme Court, either in these 3 or 4 cases, is going to make America better and make it easier for you at First Liberty, or you're going to have a whole lot more work to do in the next couple of years. What's your thoughts?
Yes, well, my thoughts. Where do I even begin? I have so many thoughts on this. But I thank you so much for bringing up this topic. I think compelled speech is a really nuanced area of free speech law that not a lot of people hear about or really even think about. It's
right.
It's not quite as obvious to you as, you know, you're speaking in a public park about politics and a police officer arrests you, right? That's very obvious. That's what people, you know, comes to your mind when you think of free speech. But the government cannot compel your speech in the same way they can't limit your speech. And It's the other side of the same coin. And it's very fundamental to our rights to say the government cannot force me to speak an idea, a concept, a viewpoint that I find abominable, that I disagree with, or maybe that I just don't even really like that much, right? And so I am surprised at the turn, as you mentioned, we've seen in the last few years where compelled speech cases are on the rise, and a lot of it's local government ordinances. So NIFLA, Liberty Institute, First Liberty Institute, actually, when we were Liberty Institute, actually represented 3 Austin pregnancy resource centers in the state of Texas. Identical facts. An ordinance was passed. They said you have to put up this sign in your parking lot that says we are not real medical facilities, even though they actually have a doctor on staff. And
sonograms and ultrasound and nurses and everything else. And
then further, the next is referring people to those who will complete the abortion instead of, in lieu of their pregnancy resource. So this is pregnancy resource centers who dedicated their lives to helping women in this time keep their baby and know they can do it, and enabling women to do that, being told they have to actively support a cause that is not theirs, that they're adamantly opposed to. And so I just can't overstate how important these issues are enough, but keep your eye on it. This is luckily the most pro-speech court we've ever had in history. So we've been winning a lot of speech cases unanimously. I know a unanimous Supreme Court kind of surprises people, but I'm hoping, you know, at least on the pregnancy resource case, that's going to be really clear. Now, when it comes to the Baker's case, that involves some LGBT issues and some, you know, competition of rights there. So that might be a little bit less clear cut of a victory, but hopefully still a victory. And then, of course, the union membership fees falls in the same category.
Yes.
So, you know, we have had previous cases that say your campaign dollars, your donor dollars, whether it's going to be to a nonprofit or a campaign or your church, that's a form of speech, actually. And that's saying, I'm going to proactively support this issue. I'm going to get behind this issue in an active way and be a part of their advocacy. And so to force people to pay membership dues to unions who might, as I mentioned earlier, be completely opposed to issues you care about, that's another form of compelled speech.
You know, and again, it illustrates the importance of one Supreme Court justice, because a number of years ago, you had a case that was very similar to this one about unions, but Justice Antonin Scalia died, and so it ended up being 4-4. It would have been decided 5-4, and I have a pretty good idea how he would have decided it, and that would have made the difference. So he has now been replaced by Neil Gorsuch. Well, that's interesting, because in that case where they were dealing with the pregnancy resource centers, Neil Gorsuch at one point said, now, wait a minute, the state of California has all sorts of ways to publicize and promote abortions. Why are you forcing these small pregnancy resource centers to do your job?
Right.
Which I thought was a good question. And when you have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was an ACLU lawyer and is about as pro-choice as anybody you could find on the court, saying, these regulations seem really burdensome, which was kind of the word of the day. I think we know where that case might end up. And, of course, we had Michael Ferris on here recently to talk about that, and he actually gave the oral arguments. But, Caroline, as an individual that's worked on the life issue for more than a decade, I know you have some thoughts about this as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think NIFLA versus Becerra is a huge deal. I'm so glad that it is at the Supreme Court right now. And when I read the transcripts of the oral arguments, it did look like Ginsburg, Kagan, and some others had some. They were confused as to why are we having this discussion? Why are we doing this? It doesn't make sense, because it doesn't make sense that a law would compel or even coerce, could be another word, a pregnancy center to advertise for the abortion industry, yet the abortion industries don't have a sign that says, hey, do you want to keep your baby? Call here. They're not compelled or forced to do that. So it's not even an even deal. Right. And the other thing is, I think a lot of people on kind of the pro-abortion side say, oh, well, you know, we have to, it's burdensome for us to tell the woman, you know, all of the, like informed consent.
Right.
Oh, if you have an abortion, you have an increased risk of substance abuse, an increased risk of suicide, you know, breast cancer link, whatever it is, depending on the state or whatever, there's certain things for those states that do have informed consent laws, but it's not the same, because this is not informing people about risks or whatever dealing with abortion or risks dealing with keeping your baby. It's just an advertisement that says, you know, call this number. And they also had
large font in 16 different languages.
Yeah, it was up to 13 languages, and I believe it was 48-point font.
Yeah.
And they had two different pieces of this. So it was for the unlicensed pregnancy centers and for the licensed one. The licensed pregnancy centers are the ones that are medically licensed by the state to have to do sonograms, pregnancy tests, and that kind of medical piece. The unlicensed pregnancy centers are the ones that give women free, counseling, diapers, formula, that kind of stuff. And so they had to, the unlicensed ones had to say, we're not a licensed medical facility. We don't have a doctor on site, but they're not doing anything that would require a license. Mm-hmm. So it's unnecessary to even have to declare that. But then the 13 languages thing, it's one of those things where it's a big, it was highly lobbied in the legislature in California by Planned Parenthood and NARAL and others, that they have an agenda. And the reality is that the case that they were saying that the pregnancy centers, this is professional speech because it's business speech. Yeah. It's like, but the pregnancy centers aren't making money. Yeah. Planned Parenthood.
And they had to create a separate category of professional speech.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They had to create a category to make it work.
If anybody should be under that label of professional because they're running a business, it should be Planned Parenthood and other abortion facilities, because they're making money every time they do an abortion. Pregnancy centers are not making money.
Yeah.
They're just loving people and loving women and trying to help them through a difficult time in their life.
Well, again, your example was one that George Will used. Imagine if you turned it around and forced abortion clinics to advertise for pregnancy resource centers. The howl would be deafening on all of that. But as we go to a break, Chelsey, when we come back from the break, we can all say why we're grateful that we live in the state of Texas. Because think about this, in the state of California, it was considered in the California Assembly and passed, was considered in the California Senate and was passed. It was then signed by the governor, and then it went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which I love George Will's line the other day, which is has rulings which are frequently novel and frequently overturned before it finally made its way to the Supreme Court. And having grown up in California, I know you have a sister in California. Mm-hmm. Aren't you glad you live in Texas instead of what everybody in California has to deal with?
Yeah, my heart goes out to California very genuinely. When I get calls from California, devastating sometimes.
We'll talk about that and get into a couple of other stories that we haven't mentioned yet, including a victory for First Liberty. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. America was saddened to learn of the loss of Billy Graham. Some have openly wondered whether history will ever witness another one like him. The better question to ask at this point in our history may be, can there be another Billy Graham? Graham's crusades were public expressions of faith, many times taking place on public property. In 1952, Graham's crusade visited Washington, D.C. Graham held services on the very steps of the United States Capitol, enlisting supportive government officials to secure the permission needed for such an event. He would go on to preach at dozens of the country's most historic and publicly owned venues, including what is today known as Camping World Stadium. In 2015, the football teams from two Christian schools in Florida faced off in that same stadium where, in 1969 and again in 1983, Billy Graham stood to share his gospel message with thousands in attendance. Incredibly, these two religious schools were denied use of the city-owned microphone to pray over the same loudspeaker once used to amplify the disarming baritone voice of Billy Graham as he preached and prayed. If the First Amendment does not protect the right of two Christian schools to pray for 30 seconds over a city-owned loudspeaker in 2015, can it protect the next Billy Graham who wants to use the same public address system in the same stadium? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talked about the teacher walkouts, but I thought for just a minute, as we were talking about some of these Supreme Court decisions, that this would be a chance to also talk about the good work being done at First Liberty. And Chelsey Youman, of course, is with us. And we will spend more time probably on Friday in our weekend edition with Kelly Shackelford talking about this case. But many people, if they've been listening for a while, say, didn't we have a story about an Air Force leader that had a little bit of hesitation about whether or not he could sign something that acknowledged a person of the same sex as being a spouse? And a lot of people wondered, well, what happened to his career? The good news is you got some very important rulings that came down.
Yes, some very exciting rulings, not to give it away. But yes, Colonel Bohannon is an Air Force one-star general, who served for over 20 years. He actually has a Bronze Star in as many of one of his commendable honors that he's received. So very, very, very respected, high integrity individual serving our country and our nation in the Air Force. And as part of his duties, when a member of his team, gets gets honored, he can sign a certificate for their spouse. It's kind of the equivalent of sending flowers, like
spousal appreciation,
spousal appreciation certificate. Well, one of the individuals was same-sex married, so his spouse was of the same sex, and Colonel Bohan sought, advice from his military chaplain and others, and he really felt like in his religious conviction and his views that marriage is between one man and one woman, he could not sign the certificate of appreciation without acknowledging same-sex marriage. And so he actually asked his two-star general above him to sign in his stead, which means it was signed by an even higher level official than it was originally going to be. But nonetheless, that really offended his military service members, and they filed a complaint against him, and the Air Force opened a full-fledged investigation against him. I mean, we've seen this many times in our line of work where those don't always end well or have not in past administrations. Now, all that to say, this week on Monday, we entered on his behalf and appealed all the way up to the Secretary of the Air Force, and Secretary Wilson of the Air Force, and he agreed on Monday that Colonel Bohan had religious liberty rights to abstain from signing that document.
Yes. Well, again, I'm kind of a simple man, but let's look at these issues, because in almost every case you have, in this case, he, as a one-star general, didn't sign it, but a two-star general signed it. In the case of Jack Phillips, he said, look, I can't bake the cake, but there are all sorts of bakeries that can do that. In the case of Aaron and Melissa Klein, they said, okay, we couldn't really bake a cake for your lesbian ceremony, but here's a place where you can go. I know of pharmacists that said, I cannot in good conscience give out RU486 or the Plan B or a birth control pill, but there's all these other pharmacies that are not even far away that you can go to. In every case, there has never been a burden on the individual, so it illustrates again that they're just really going out trying to hunt down any of those individuals who have Christian convictions and try to shame them or even put them out of their job.
We see a lot of setups or discrimination claims, and part of that is, and I think this is important for the country to know, is that Obergefell, when it was decided, it recognized that same-sex marriage was a fundamental right. You've heard that before. What that means is it's a fundamental right akin to the right to educate your child or parent your child as you wish, the fundamental right to abortion. But what the opinion specifically did not do is it did not make, the sexual orientation or gender identity a protected class. And so they didn't give it the same level of weight that race is a protected class, national origin is a protected class. Actually, religion is a protected class under the First Amendment. So we have protected classes that really get super, what we call bolstered statutory and constitutional protections. Their rights are hyper protected. And I think what's happening is the LGBT community is trying to get this fundamental right really weighed more heavily in their favor and build it up to be a protected class. And so that's why the civil rights investigation was opened up against Colonel Bohannon. But at the end of the day, the Trump administration and their selected Secretary Wilson did the right thing, recognized the original protected class, which is religious liberty rights. And we're really excited about the opportunities we have to really bolster religious liberty protections with this new administration.
And would the Secretary come to the same conclusion if you had a different president? Because who the commander-in-chief is oftentimes sends a signal downstream to some of those individuals. So, again, it makes a point that I think elections do have a consequence.
Oh, absolutely. Instead of this resulting in drawn-out litigation and court orders and everything it could have been, which neither party really wants, we want to resolve this amicably as possible. But in the past, under the Obama administration, that's what this has resulted in. When we've seen discrimination in the military, we've had to go to bat and we've had to file cases. And instead, this was rendered really quickly, and it's a quick victory, and it's a good outcome for everyone.
Caroline, I knew you have some comments because you've been commenting as we've been going along here. So, what are your thoughts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that Chelsey touched on something really great, which is kind of the distinguishing between protected class. It is homosexuality equivalent to race in terms of legal protection, and the reality it's not the same. It's not equivalent, and I think the other thing that you touched on, Kerby, is that when, for example, Jack Phillips said, "I'm not going to bake a cake," but he did offer, "You can have anything in my, do you want cookies? I can make you a cake for another occasion. I just can't make a cake for this specific occasion. And the media and others have kind of been posturing this issue to be like, oh, this is equivalent to not serving somebody of a particular race in your restaurant and saying, you're not welcome in my restaurant, get out, you look different than I do. This is a very, very different case because Jack Phillips did not say, get out of my restaurant, or I'm sorry, get out of my bakery, but he just said, I cannot serve you this particular cake for this particular occasion. And so it wasn't that he was refusing to serve them, he was just refusing a specific service. And I also think that I think it's misguided and misleading to compare race to sexual orientation because pre-civil rights, African Americans in this country were not able to use the same restrooms, drink from the same water fountains, ride on public transportation. They were barred from, in many cases, barred from renting a home and staying at certain hotels. And it was a systemic barring from society. Those who are homosexual are able to, take a train. They're able to drink from water fountains. They're able to use restrooms. This is not a systemic barring from you are a persona non grata. You're not allowed in our society. That is not the case. It's just the reality is that we live in a country where we all have very different, oftentimes different opinions, and we need to be able to live amicably with each other and give each other grace and say, okay, if that offends you, I'm okay with that. It's like not requiring a kosher deli to make a swastika cake and saying that's my right.
Yeah.
You do have a right to make a swastika cake if you would like to, but don't require somebody to do that.
Sounds like compelled speech, which is what we've been talking about.
Full circle.
We need to take a break, and when we come back, we are certainly going to continue our conversation about a number of issues, but I thought we'd just give you a little bit of an update on some of those legal issues as well, and be in prayer about those, because more of these compelled speech cases are before the Supreme Court, and if they're ruled in the favor of religious liberty, this is going to be a good thing. If the ruling goes the other way, Chelsey and Kelly Shackelford and everybody are going to have a lot more to do. So let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. That will happen right after this.
Sarita is a Point of View listener in Georgia, someone probably a lot like you. Listening to your program, she writes, has helped me realize that I do have the power to conduct change in my area and this nation. And with all of the online tools you provide, this power has become even more apparent to me. What can one person do? A whole lot, says Sarita. And then she says, and together we can get even more done. She's right. Sarita is right. This is a moment of opportunity, and together with you, Point of View is looking to accomplish a lot. This program and those online tools she mentioned will only continue being available if we hear from people like you this week. Join Truth Team 360. There are many levels. Check them out. Choose the size of the part you can play at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary
because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think you guys, y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.